And thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here. It's a pleasure. I've met some wonderful people already. What do I do at IBM? I'm currently our cloud security leader for Europe. So I work with all sorts of clients around cloud security, and we've got some specific kind of products and solutions in that space, which if I started to tell you about them, you'd boo me off stage for trying to, give you the sales pitch. So you can ask me afterwards if you want. I've worked with Darlem a few times. I'm a fellow of the BCS. I'm an ISACA member and did my CISM, I think, a year or so ago. I've been in cybersecurity for about 5 years. I've been in IBM a little bit longer than that. But I'm not the main event this evening. The two people who are really going to cover the content are Gina and Andy, and they'll introduce themselves. I think I'm the warm-up act, just for a few minutes, and my role is to do a little bit of a level set, because we've got all sorts of people here, from security gurus, looking at you, Diana, through to some people I've met here who have all sorts of other roles, or are retired, or do kind of general IT consultancy, or here because they walked into the wrong room, perhaps. So I'm literally just going to spend a few minutes talking about why we're even bothering to think about cybersecurity this evening, and some of the trends and changes that we've seen in the last couple of years before handing over. So my first question to you is, or request is, give me a wave if you have been the victim of some sort of data breach. So who hasn't got their hand up? A few. I bet the rest of you have. So if you've never looked at the site, have I been, it's pwnd-owned.com. You can put your email address in and it will tell you whether your credentials have been breached at some point in a cyber attack. Last year, there were 8.5 billion records, personal records, stolen. So that's slightly more than the world population, and it's about twice the amount of people in the world who have internet access. So it means, on average, people with internet access, like all of us in this room, will have had our credentials stolen probably twice, or have been breached probably twice on average. So if you think that your credentials are fully safe and secure, it might be worth checking. Some big well-known attacks in the past few years, like Spotify and LinkedIn, Sony, British Airways, not so big, but quite local, obviously, to most of us. So have a look, you might be surprised. When we start to think about the overall scale of cyber attacks and the impact that it has on people like us, the scale is huge. So last year we saw a 200% increase in the number of sophisticated cyber attacks against organizations. The average cost of a data breach now is around £2.5 million, but for sophisticated kind of destructive attacks, some sort of ransomware or some other attack deliberately designed to cause harm, it can be 60 times that amount, which is, what, £150 million? Eye-watering, massive sums of money. When you think about things like the impact that WannaCry had on the NHS and appointments being cancelled, or the British Airways attack again, where people's flights were cancelled and personal details were stolen and transactions had to be cancelled and traveller information was lost, etc. It has a huge impact on all of us, from big businesses right down to individuals and governments and everyone else in between. Just a couple of other things that we see happening. So the scale is huge, 200% increase last year. The vast majority of data breaches are still caused by inadvertent insiders. So IT professionals like us who perhaps didn't configure a server quite right, or had an unsecured cloud service somewhere, or some sort of rsync backup which wasn't sufficiently protected on the internet. 86% of all cyber attacks involve someone like me or you, or some system somewhere not being configured properly, or us accidentally somehow leaving a vulnerability exposed. And it feels like we should be doing better than that now. That's actually a massive increase last year over 2018, a 40% increase on the amount of inadvertent errors, typically just a couple of misconfiguration or unpatched systems which are responsible for the vast majority of attacks. The other thing which makes it harder, though, is IoT. So again, looking at last year, we saw a 2,000% increase in the amount of attacks which use IoT as the kind of attack vector, the way in. And that's partly because there are so many devices now attached to the internet, and industrial control systems, home systems. All of us, I guess, have 3 or 4 devices, or a dozen, which are attached somehow to different networks. And they're quite a good way in for attackers into your network, into corporate networks. And that the rise last year was phenomenal in the amount of attacks coming in via IoT devices. So cloud is an issue, IoT is an issue, the sheer volume and scale and complexity of attacks is an issue, and it feels like we're not really winning yet when it comes to cybersecurity. The last thing I'll talk about is still the top kind of attack vector, the top way which attackers will typically get into a network is through phishing attacks. Something like 35% of all attacks involve phishing. And again, it feels like we should be better at that by now. We should be more aware, more savvy. So Jasmine there in the corner, 14, 15, every day is getting education at school about don't click on this link, don't give out stuff. But perhaps to the point earlier, maybe there's a generation of us which we get training through work, but perhaps we're not as savvy, and still a third of all attacks involve, again, people like us clicking on Google primarily, then Amazon, then Apple. They're the common sites which get impersonated, and we willingly give away our credentials, and that becomes the route into an organization. So it feels like we've got a long way to go in cybersecurity. So what we're focusing on tonight are two topics. Firstly, Gina's going to talk a bit about financial crime in general and some of the tools and techniques that are used to help kind of investigate fraud and financial crimes, and then relate that to cybersecurity. Then Andy's going to talk a bit about incident response, and given that we don't seem to yet be winning this cyber war that we're in, how do we respond well? And then a bit of a look to the future to what are we going to do to get even better at how we respond, because the quicker you can stop an attack, the more you can minimize the risk and reduce the cost, etc. So does that sound like a reasonable use of an hour? Any thoughts, comments, questions, any disagreements, anything to add before we hand over to the pros? Darling, you have a question.
Yeah, I have something to add. And I'm very remiss as a chair. I have to make sure you've all signed in via the list that Jasmine, Mike's daughter, took around, haven't you? Yeah? Okay. Jasmine, what have I forgotten? Right. What I'm supposed to do as a good chairperson is to say we're not expecting any bells or whistles or whatever, other than the ones we'll get from Mike and colleagues, of course. but if we do hear some, then we have to head out. And where we have to go is there is an exit, which is the way you came. That's the easiest one to take. So just follow the little white figure on the green background, leads you out into the street. There is actually another one, and that is in the room which is to our left. And at the back of that room, there is another exit. I've been tripped up by this in the past because somebody did use that exit, but that's actually an emergency exit. So that has the added attribute of setting off alarms in reception. Only use that in the case of a real emergency. Otherwise, just go out the way that you came in. If you need to go out for any other reason, the toilets are around at the back of this room, over there. So just work your way around, and there are facilities there. If you need to leave during this event, despite the fascinating material you're going to be hearing, then feel free. Just try not to disturb too many people in the row that you're in. Yeah? That's it. I did it. Thank you. Okay. Oh, maybe we do have some robots here. Let me introduce you to Robot Gina.
I've got the mic, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But here's Mike. Oh, I'm getting really confused. I'm going to sit down.
Hi everybody, my name is Gina Collins. I'm a technical specialist at IBM Security. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the analysis tradecraft and link analysis techniques that have been used for decades in law enforcement and by banks and insurance companies to help to identify and investigate criminal, fraudulent, and increasingly now moving into kind of investigating and identifying cybercrime as well. So link analysis as a technique It basically uses an underlying kind of graph-like structure. So you essentially have your entities or nodes, which could be people, they could be telephones, they could be bank accounts. And then you've got your edges or links, which is how they are related and connect to one another. So it could be that people have been sited at the same location. It could be that a person lives at an address. It could be telephone communications between two individuals. And it's essentially allowing you to identify relationships, sometimes kind of hidden connections between entities. So in the law enforcement world, like we've got from, can anyone identify these two investigations? So one is from Breaking Bad. Don't know if anyone's watched Breaking Bad. This is looking at the drug gang behind under Gus as part of Breaking Bad. And then this is from 21 Jump Street. But essentially, before the technology existed, people were still using link analysis techniques on a link board like this to show how individuals are connected, to identify where someone sits within an organised crime group. Now we've got the technology to kind of back that up. It means that we're able to not just visualise those connections, but actually interact, actually get a better understanding and analyse those connections in more detail. So that's in the sense of law enforcement, where you might be looking to show how a suspect is linked to an accomplice. You might be looking to place a suspect at the location of a crime. If you move more into the financial world, you're probably looking more at identifying things like money laundering and identifying fraudulent activity. So I'm going to go through a few examples of how this might look for financial crimes, and then I'll link that back to how it's starting to be used. The same link analysis techniques are starting to be used to tackle cybercrime as well. Perfect. So this is an example, quite a basic link analysis chart, starting out looking at some kind of financial data. And what we've got here is we've got 4 different user accounts. So these could be user accounts logging into a bank, online banking system. They could be user accounts logging into an online retailer to make a purchase. Or they could be user accounts related to an insurance company, and they might be logging in to make a claim. Now, it's useful to model data in this kind of graph-like structure because it allows you to ask questions of the data. It allows you to look for common features across different entities. So in this case, we can easily see that these 4 user accounts are sharing the same device. And that could be an indicator of fraudulent activity. But it's only kind of part of the, a piece of information that you would want to combine with other information. Because this could be an indicator of fraudulent activity, or it could be a home computer and 4 family members are logging in on the same computer. So that information alone, we're not going to start firing off alerts and alarms and preventing people logging in. But combining that with the rest of the information, we kind of build up a picture. So sometimes the commonalities can be genuine. In this second example, we've kind of built out more of a picture here of a new user account being created, and in this case, a purchase being made. So we've got a user account, and the way that we've modeled this data, we've drawn out some identifier information about this specific user. So we've drawn out the registered address as a separate entity. We've drawn out the registered email address, the person's name, date of birth, and mobile telephone number. And the reason why we've drawn those out as separate entities is so that we can ask questions. For example, if we identify some fraudulent activity that this mobile phone has been involved in, we might want to pivot from that mobile phone and ask the question, what other user accounts has it been linked to? What other orders has it been linked to? And we can start to build up a kind of fraudulent network of identifiers. So we've got all of these different identifier pieces of information about the user account. We can see that this user has placed an order losing this particular device and with this particular registered credit card details. They've then asked for the order to be shipped to an alternate address, which again, pretty normal behaviour. They could be sending it to a work address, or it could be a gift that they're sending to someone. So there's nothing really suspicious here, but we've got quite a lot of information about, one order being created. This might be a little bit more suspicious. So if this individual has actually registered a number of other credit card details against their account, this might be a bit of a flag. This might be something we're interested in, because these credit card details could be stolen. And so typically when, as Mike was saying before, credit card details or user account details are stolen, they're stolen in the masses. And so you'll typically see people kind of churning through credentials and churning through credit card details to see which ones are still active, which ones will work. So this might be potentially suspicious. And, this one could have been suspicious. Again, these could be stolen credentials, but that information alone is probably, we'd give them the benefit of the doubt that's probably a family. If we expand this out further, what we've done here is we've now got 2 user accounts. If I just go on one further. So we've got this second user account, and we've got information about that user, like the credit cards that they've registered. And we can see in the middle, they're sharing some information. So they're sharing the same device, they've got the same person name, and they've got the same registered address on their account. So potentially suspicious. But again, it could be 2 family members registering at the same address, using the same home computer. This second user has also placed an order and shipped it to this same alternate address. So by modelling the data in this link analysis way, we're able to kind of easily see those commonalities. Sorry, have you got a question? Oh, no, sorry. Please ask questions if you've got any. But yeah, by modelling the data in this kind of link analysis way, we're able to easily see those connections. And if we expanded this out further, this alone, again, it doesn't look particularly suspicious. But if we built out this picture and we actually had lots of other user accounts, also with 10, 20 credit cards registered to them, also purchasing the same item, shipping to this address, that again could be an example where we're identifying fraudulent activity. People are using stolen credit card details, sending to a single address for them to then be resold on. So at the moment, we haven't proven any fraudulent activity, but we're building out a picture. And as soon as we identify fraudulent activity, everything will get linked to that fraudulent activity. So these email addresses, telephone numbers, and then like I was saying before, you can then pivot from those telephone numbers, from those identifiers, email addresses, whatever it may be, to identify anything else that they're involved in. You might identify additional orders, it might be insurance claims, whatever it may be, that you then want to investigate as potentially fraudulent.
Excuse me, when would a fraudster be creating multiple user accounts? Would that arouse suspicion?
Yeah, so it would potentially arouse suspicion, but people may be creating multiple accounts. So a lot of the time with people signing up to phone contracts. So an individual person will create multiple accounts to sign up to a phone contract that they never intend to pay for because they might get a free gift. So they're using stolen credentials, they're creating lots of different accounts.
But this is using the same person's name?
So it may be that that could be genuine, or it could be that people use the same set of identifiers, but they kind of switch through different combinations of them. So you might use the same, you might have a bunch of different names, email addresses. You don't want to create a different email address every single time you're opening an account because it will get quite hard to manage. So you might do different combinations of...
It's all within the same organization, like let's say Vodafone or whatever.
Yeah. So it's just equally, it could be like the telephone providers if they are going for that kind of free gift option. or similarly with insurance claims, using different variations to kind of try and mask what they're doing.
Or somebody could have different businesses and different business interests.
So it's not on its own, not necessarily an indicator on its own, but combined with other information, for example, like multiple credit cards being added to different accounts, or if you did have multiple user accounts for very similar variations of names and combinations of email addresses and other identifier information, that could be an indicator of fraudulent activity.
Is this sort of system deployed in the background, running live, so it can pass out an alert for further investigation in real time, or is it a lot of latency in systems like this?
So there will be options for both. So typically in a live system, you will get some kind of fraud reporting solution that will flag up against certain rules. This kind of approach is typically looking at data after that stage. Yeah, historical. But what it will do is it will feed into that real-time alerting. So if we've, through this kind of analysis, identified fraudulent activity, for example, if we then get another claim coming in using the same telephone number that we've linked to previous fraudulent activity, that can then come up as a flag. This is high risk. We've linked it to fraudulent activity before.
Yeah, because typically a bank will run a pattern spotting software, which does run pretty close to real time.
Yeah.
So you could then, presumably historically, when you spot something in the pattern software throws up an alert, then you can then start to do some historical analysis.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'll go through another slightly different example. So within financial crimes, another thing that we can start to identify is instances of money laundering. So when money has been illegally obtained and you're trying to mask the source of that money. And so criminals will use a variety of techniques to try and mask where that money has come from. So in this example, the techniques that they've used is they've smuggled cash into another country, deposited it into an offshore account, and then transferred it to an intermediary account before transferring it on in smaller batches so that it won't get flagged up as easily onto the account that they want to, where they want the money to actually be for them to withdraw it or do whatever they want with it. So if you were looking at this data in a kind of relational database, it would be much harder to identify that flow of money. You'd just be looking at a kind of list of transactions. Being able to kind of visualize the data in this way and actually query that flow of money, you can more easily identify instances of where people are trying to mask where money has come from or where money is going, for example, with terrorist funding. So this same analysis tradecraft and link analysis approach can be used to investigate and identify cybercrime as well. So it is the same challenge, the same approach, but rather than your bank account entities and your order entities, your people entities, you're looking at threat actors, you're looking at malware, you're looking at network communications, network connections between digital assets. So it's just a different set of entities, but you can still analyze that data in the same way. And within kind of cyber threat hunting and cyber investigation teams, a lot of the time they're actually looking to employ people from a law enforcement background, from a military background, because they've got that kind of analysis tradecraft and they've got that experience in analysing the data in this way. So Mike kind of touched on some of these key challenges, but cybercrime is an increasing problem. It comes at a huge cost, so estimated $6 trillion lost annually to cybercrime. 61% of companies reported a cyber attack. Whether that led to a massive breach or not, it may not have, but there's a large proportion of firms that are actually reporting cyber attacks. And then 2,795 UK data breaches were reported to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK in 2019. So it's an increasing problem, and it comes at quite a large cost. So it's something that is a growing problem. So for link analysis, just to show you an example of how this might look in a cyber context, the entities are different, but the approach is the same. So in this case, we're doing some analysis on on a threat group. So we can have a look at what industries this threat group targets. So if we're a telecoms organisation, we might be interested in tracking this threat group, understanding who else they're targeting, what attacks that they have been responsible for in the past, what techniques they use, what malware they've used in the past, so that we can understand the risk against our own organisation. And we can link these techniques out to possible mitigations, so we can make sure we're taking the necessary steps to avoid those risks. And we're linking the malware out to indicators of compromise. So this could be anything from a kind of IP address or any kind of indicator that malware might be in your environment. It could be unusual user activity, a change in privileges, any kind of indicator that malware might exist. And we can then expand this out to actually look at our internal environment as well. So looking here, we can see this threat group has used this particular malware, which exploits a specific vulnerability. And we can have a look at that vulnerability and whether we've got anything in our internal environment, any critical assets that would be at risk from that vulnerability, to start to try and prioritise any patching or any actions that need to be taken to avoid that threat group being a real risk to our organisation. Similarly, we can have a look at any indicators of compromise that have been identified in our network. So if a digital asset has a link to one of these indicators of compromise, we might want to investigate that. It might not necessarily mean that we've got some malware in our environment, but it is, or we've had a massive data breach, but it might be an indicator that there is a threat actor within your environment, and you want to take action to avoid a data breach or to avoid any other kind of attack. And just to mention, actually, in terms of these challenges, this isn't just big organisations. This is smaller organisations as well. I'm in the process of buying a front door, which was meant to be fitted last week, but the supplier of the door has been targeted by ransomware. So all of their systems went down, and obviously they get a notice that says you need to pay us a fee if you want your systems back. But I just found that quite interesting that even like a door supplier is being targeted, quite a small local company, by cyber attackers. So again, just modelling the data in this way, it's allowing us to not only visualise the data, but ask questions of the data to look for commonalities and to look for relationships and connections. And they don't need to be immediate connections. They can be a kind of 2-step, 3-step, 4-step, 5-step away. So it's like with the fraudulent example, you're not looking for activity that directly connects to that telephone number that's been linked to crime. You can say, show me everything that's within 8 jumps of that telephone number, and it might then increase the risk of anything that is even loosely connected to something that's been connected to fraud in the past. And it's the same with the cyber context. So we're asking a question here where we're saying, show me all of the network communications where something in our internal network has connected to something else that's linked to an indicator of compromise that's linked to a malware campaign. So it allows you to ask those kind of questions to drill into potentially suspicious activity. And finally, just to kind of summarise the benefits of link analysis for tackling cybercrime or financial crime or criminal activity. So it's easier to interpret and understand what's going on than with traditional databases. traditional business intelligence or just looking at Excel spreadsheets, which is what a lot of organisations will still do. You get much better interaction and querying capability to actually ask those questions, to look for commonalities and to reveal hidden connections. So whether that is a flow of money, like we looked at with the money laundering example, it could be a flow of data or information if you're looking at communication data, to identify kind of suspicious activity. And it will allow you to kind of map out that fraudster or cybercriminal network by identifying a particular entity, whether that's a telephone number, whether that's a digital asset, linking that to criminal activity, and then building out a network to understand the risks against your organisation.
So all of this will depend on the data that you have. So where do you get that extensive data from that allows you to make these kind of connections? It's not going to reside in one organization, it's going to be multiple organizations. And I'm not aware that anyone's sharing data in all one place.
No, so it will depend on the scenario. It's completely depend on the use case. So in the cyber context, most of this came from the MITRE attack framework. Within that, you have information about threat groups linked to techniques they've used, linked to malware they've used, mitigations that are possible. But then that's integrated with a little bit of internal data to say, have we seen anything like this in our environment? So it'll be a combination of owned data along with external feeds as well. So in the cyberspace, there's a lot of different threat intelligence feeds that are available, and it'll be a case of working out what is required depending on the kind of questions you want to be able to ask. With the financial crimes examples, you're looking at kind of transactional data, you're looking at most of this will be data that you've got internally for this example.
On the money laundering graph, do you have the ability to feed in where they're cashing out? Do you have information about the final, say, bank as to how good have they done a KYC or not? And if so, how good is it? How reliable is it? So you can then start spotting patterns of banks, perhaps overseas, which you need to be careful about.
Exactly. So I think that, again, if you identify some activity like this, you can then start saying, okay, what banks were used here? And you can ask that kind of question, what organisations do we have that are in any way linked to these banks? And you might start to identify other instances of money laundering. You know, just from identifying one instance here, you pick up on a dodgy offshore bank, and then you say, okay, well, what else is that connected to up to 5 or 6 degrees, to start to potentially identify other organisations involved in these kind of schemes. Any other questions?
Two questions. So IBM providing this as a service to the big banks, is that right?
Yeah, most big banks use IBM tooling, yeah.
Sending information to IBM, or you provide it as a managed service?
They will typically have it installed on site. So this is a product.
So don't want the personal information to transfer outside of the bank?
No, yeah. Not. I mean, they could do, but at the moment, most of the banks don't have this as a managed service. They use this kind of tooling in-house, on the, connected up, installed in-house and connected up to their own systems.
And you mentioned the whole problem is the privacy protections. Even the best of us have the data leaked from a bigger company. So another question is obviously you have a lot of valuable data and a lot of outcome of valuable data that's being used by banks for tackling fraudulent and tackling money laundering. These information are very rich. Are you considering using these information to solve a state
So increasingly, these kind of tools are being used in that context. It is a fairly new area. Well, it's not a new area, but I think it depends on your maturity in the kind of cyber security world. So people's initial focus will be on getting first-line defences in and setting up a kind of security intelligence environment. This is used more for your kind of more advanced threat investigations and threat hunting, which people are starting to employ people for, like I was saying, typically from a kind of law enforcement and military background, but it kind of comes further down their maturity. So it is something that we are working with organisations on, but it's taking a little bit longer to get there.
Can I just ask, you said at the beginning about graphs. Is it actually using a graph database behind the scenes?
It is a graph-like database, so we have tables with entities and links. Yeah, it's our own version.
Small question. Is the reporting of cybercrime increasing? Do you see that trend? Or is it decreasing?
The report in relation to GDPR. Well, are people keeping quiet about it? Mike, would you?
I think you have to report, as you said, 3,000
Yeah.
the ICO last year.
Well, so the ICO are seeing, they are one of our customers, and they're seeing their team has tripled. They're seeing quite a big increase in their kind of workload, really, because I think people have to report it in. There's more of a requirement for it. So yeah.
But it's still that we said 61% of firms have experienced a cyber attack, and yet there were 2,795 reports to the ICO.
Mm-hmm.
But there are, if you include self-employed people, there are 5 million entities in the UK. So 60% of them would imply that there are 3 million incidents. Some of them would be very minor, sending an email to the wrong person or something.
Yeah. So
there are an awful lot of people who don't know they have to report it to the ICO.
Yeah.
Or they report it late, or they try and avoid it.
yeah, and I mean, there's a difference between those numbers. So that's a cyber attack doesn't necessarily mean that there's been data breached. But yeah, there probably are instances where people don't fully understand what they need to be reporting in on.
So even global financial services companies, remember Travelex at the beginning of the year, they couldn't do foreign exchange because they'd been hacked.
Yeah.
They didn't report to the ICO. Even a week after it happened, they hadn't reported to the ICO. The ICO contacted them and said,
By the way,
yeah,
did they get fined?
they haven't been fined yet,
Okay.
but it takes a while.
Yeah.
Still, British Airways have just been told what the fine will be, and that was from the summer before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it does take a long time to go through.
Mm. Any other questions, or before I hand over to Andy?
How do you use link analysis to track fraudulent activities using bitcoins and cryptocurrency?
It's not actually something that I've.
Could you just repeat the question?
So how do we use link analysis to identify fraudulent activity using cryptocurrencies? So the principles would be the same. It's not something that I've been involved with, and I don't know of any customers using it in that context. But I'm sure it would be possible. But I don't have any experience in that area, unfortunately.
Because most of the WannaCry incidents were based on some Bitcoin sites.
Something we need to look into. Mm. Okay, I'll hand over to Nikki. Can you unmute me? Power me down.
I wanted it. You look like a robot. So cool. I think somebody spoke to my girlfriend who said apparently I've already got the emotions of a robot, so I don't need one of these. I should have a mic somewhere. I don't know if we can bring up the other presentation as well. Hello.
Oh, you need to press the button.
The red button?
This
Press
one.
the red button.
Press that one.
Hello. Hello. Cool. Right. So let's go at this. How do we get onto the other presentation? We got a techie. I'm not a techie really. I fake to be a techie, right? When it comes to PowerPoint.
There is a way, but I don't know where it is.
All right, we lost our techie, so. Oh man. Suddenly understand the pain. It's probably a good question, isn't it, right?
Where are you going?
You don't have to be loud. Yes, so the future of incident response, which is now, by the time it's taken me to get this loaded up by myself. Right, so we go back one. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so when I was asked to come present, I was a bit unsure about what type of audience I was going to have. You know, you obviously get some people in the room who are going to be super technical. You get some people who are obviously just starting off in this career, might be students, might be, as we discussed earlier, of a later generation that may not necessarily understand security in depth. So I wanted to create some content that basically isn't too patronising to the people that are super techy and understand this industry and work in it, but also something where, you know, people that are starting out in this field can really start to understand it. So I'm going to say apologies to both sides, because it's probably just a compromise for both of you, right? So before I kick things off, my name's Andrew Yates. I'm one of the technical sales specialists for incident response in IBM. I've worked for IBM for about 3 years now. So I look after our customers both from a pre-sales capacity, but also in the past have done professional services. So that's helping customers mature within incident response, looking at how they can respond more efficiently, how they build playbooks, how they integrate with other platforms, and align to certain models such as MITRE and a few others. Prior to this, I worked at RSA. I was in the Net Witness team, so that was in a SIEM platform, so more of a detection type platform. And there I was a technical consultant, so I helped to teach organizations how to actually hunt malware, how you'd use things like packet capture to hunt threat actors within your environment from a proactive standpoint. So there's going to be a bit of both in today's topic. Before I kick things off, could I just have a show of hands? Who feels like they understand incident response really well? Okay. Notice I didn't put my hand up, right? So, and how many people feel like they're relatively comfortable to starting out with IR and understand security? Yeah, neither. Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm really sorry for everybody here because it's going to be really. Okay, well, I'm just going to jump into it. So, first thing I wanted to do was kind of set the scene, all right? What are organizations trying to be faced with today? And actually, fundamentally, today's presentation about the future of IR, right? It's about answering the question around what does the future look like for incident response from an automation standpoint. Should have probably covered that first, so I've jumped my gun. You know, this presentation isn't going to be talking about any particular platforms, you know, specific products. You know, I've tried to keep it as generic and talk more about some of the bigger questions. And it's not even about a silver bullet, right? Or even me telling you this is what's going to come into the future. Because fundamentally, no matter what statistics we look at, it's still very difficult, even looking at the history of IR and security in general, to actually predict what the next challenge is going to be. Now, I'm giving my perspective on the conversations I have with a number of thought leaders across security, from Bruce Schneier to a few others that I won't name names. They probably won't like that. So if I jump into it, you know, if we look at the current statistics based on security, 65% of organizations are challenged with the volume of attacks. And we will come into more of the history of why we have this as an issue in more detail in a later slide. But fundamentally, you know, organizations are really struggling with just the sheer volume. And what adds complexity to that is the skill set that's required to investigate it, right? So within a security operations center, within an organization, they would be responsible for investigating triaging and remediating or responding to that incident. And also incorporating loads of other parts of the organisation. Your networking team, your legal team, your infrastructure team. It is not an A to Z when it comes to working with a SOC, right? They have many other parts of the organisation. But fundamentally, that tier 1 for triage, tier 2, tier 3, it is really, really difficult to not only acquire good talent, but to retain it and develop it. And when you combine that with the fact of all these complex attacks and how simple it is for these threat actors to actually automate now, right? We're in this age where we're starting to automate a lot of our processes, responding, enriching our data, how we remediate machines. It's all great, but our threat actors that we are faced against are also going to start using this against us. And that is really the big question for today's presentation, is what is going to happen in the future when the threat actors are automating all their attacks, as we see now, to a more sophisticated and advanced scale, and they start incorporating things like artificial intelligence. How are we, as the organisations, going to protect ourselves? The next thing is about the compliance regulation, right? So if you're a UK organisation, it's really challenging, to look at all the different legislations and regulations you need to comply with. But if you're a global organisation, that just becomes an absolute nightmare, right? So say, for example, you're a UK employee, you've got data on your machine from France, you're travelling across America from California to Arkansas, and you lose your laptop somewhere along the way. What regulations do you need to comply with? Is it both the EMEA stuff? Is there US data on there? Which jurisdiction within the US do you need to comply with? What is the timelines? How do I contact them? What's the templates? What's the physical addresses? What's the telephone numbers? Who needs to be involved in it? The amount of time it takes for an organisation to respond to a breach is enormous. And again, it's one of these situations where it's a reactive thing. And being an organisation, every other part of the business looks at you and says, you're an insurance policy, right? We're going to end up having to put these measures in, spending all this money, but if the cost of us responding to this breach is more than the fine itself, what incentive do I have at being able to respond to that? And that is part of the challenge that, again, organisations are faced with. And then finally, on this slide, the operational environment. So around 70 products it is now, on average, is the amount of investment in security tools within an organisation. I mean, firstly, that shouts complexity. It shouts a huge amount of investment, and trying to understand when you use these at the right time, at the right place, is really challenging. And again, I used to run a number of workshops when I was back at RSA, and we would actually simulate incidences within an environment. And during that time, what we would do is we would look at how they respond to it. Now, typically, a lot of the customers had all the data available to them. They had the enrichment sources, they had the endpoint data, they had the packet data. But fundamentally, they fell down because it was so siloed. And this is not a challenge that a threat actor has. A threat actor is very much skilled. They have one job to do, and that is basically to define the various different kill chains, right? So those of you that have looked at Lockheed Martin, anybody looked at Lockheed Martin kill chain? Yeah, I recommend everybody go away, have a look at Lockheed Martin kill chain. It's really good. But yeah, so they basically look at reconning an organization. They weaponize some piece of malware. They deliver it onto the endpoint. They exploit it. They get some C2 beaconing, and then they start to do that data exfiltration. That typically takes a threat actor around 14 days to act upon from start to finish. So from a threat actor's, from an organization's perspective, they've got 14 days, or potentially longer, depending on how sophisticated that attack is. Some threat actors will stay in the organization for absolutely years. But others, it's all about keeping that low profile or just very quickly exfiltrating that data. So, I really did say it was going to be basic, didn't I? So originally actually came from hacking. I don't know if we've got any equestrian fanboys in here, horse riders. To hack about is the old term that I always had when I was at university. Essentially, hackers, it's all about, in today's world of definition, it's somebody who gains unauthorized access to data. I'm sure there is much more legal depth to that as well around what we could define as a hacker. But fundamentally, a hacker is so much more than just saying, they're gaining access to it. Because when we look at how they attack, and I don't know how many people in the room have seen the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Oh, you guys are going to have such a fun weekend. I can tell you right now. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is really great because, and I genuinely advise all of you guys to go away, spend a couple of hours just going through, clicking at each of these different attacks, because this essentially models a typical threat actors attack. So we've got all of the various different stages of how they're going to infiltrate an organization, looking at the initial access, execution, persistence. Then you can dive into those and look at the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures of a threat actor. And so from that, we can actually then align it to looking at which type of threat actor groups, right? So is it somebody that's specializing in financial services? Is it somebody who is part of an activist group? The reason I say this, and the main point of this screen, is to show you how much opportunity they have and how much we have to detect and prevent against. It's enormous, right? I mean, it's not a job that can be taken lightly. And they have all this different opportunity. And it also identifies the fact that when somebody tries to hack an organization, unlike what it was like, 30 years ago when somebody was hacking about, trying to find a way of creating and doing something fun, which is my next slide. That first ever virus, I don't know if anybody can remember Creeper. I can't, but I know, it's the moisturiser. So the Creeper was actually just a little bit of code, it was a virus that was written to run on a Windows machine, not on a Windows machine, on a, I think it was, I'm going to get back to that. I forgot the machine it was running. I think it might have actually been a DOS system. But it used to pop up just saying, I'm watching you. I mean, firstly, it's a great name for it because it's super creepy, isn't it? But it didn't do anything malicious. And there was never any intent to do anything. Now, these threat actors, they're so orchestrated, there is monetary investment, there's reasons for them to do this. One of my favorite ever quotes is, if you look at the First and Second World War, right? The First World War was mustard gas and chlorine gas and mustard seeds, right? The Second World War was all about the atom. It's the physics wars. The First War was the chemist war, then we have the physics war, right? It's about the hydrogen bomb. Well, the third war is going to be the mathematician war, right? It is cyber war, right? This is going to be the next big war that we're going to have, right? We're seeing nation-state threat actors using and creating attacks that are going to take down organizations. And organizations are going to be stuck in the middle of this. And a great example of that is Stuxnet. And I probably am not allowed to talk about it in great detail, being an IBM employee. I've not been involved in it, but there's definitely evidence to support that there is potentially a nation-state threat actor behind these types of attacks. There was up to, I think it was 3 0 days in Stuxnet. What do we value as a 0 day at the moment? I think it's sort of $500,000 US. So we got up to 1.5 million of completely non-disclosed. Nobody knew about these bugs within the platform. The way that it was written, the way that it was spread, the fact that it took control of a Siemens material fusion spinner and just disabled that particular instrument within this whole cycle and how it got in there. There's a lot of arguments here about, we've moved so far away from, just creating something to annoy someone to now being the amount of money that we can earn from ransomwares, the amount of impact we can have at a nation-state level is absolutely enormous. And so, if we look through that course of history, it started off with Creeper, and there was actually a response to this where somebody wrote something called the Reaper, and that removed Creeper, but it was still a virus, but it was benign, basically. But then in 1987, this actually pushed organizations to start creating this awareness for antivirus software. So we had, I think it's G Software AG, I personally never worked with it, Flushshot, and Anti4Us, apparently. That's what Wikipedia said. It's a good source of information. So in 1992, we then saw the introduction of firewalls, and the first firewall was Dixil. And then we had SIEM. So SIEM was actually coined by Gartner. And the reason from this, and this actually structures a really big change in how we approach cybersecurity. You know, up to this point, we've been really looking at signature-based detection. So a signature is basically saying, you know, almost like showing your driver's license. It's a Boolean value. If it says your name's on the list, you can come in, or if your name's not on the list, you can't come in, right? But the problem with that is, from a threat actor's perspective, they evolved. They changed the way they were working because they understood that actually, if I write a bit of malware and I change one bit in that piece of malware that I've written, even if it's adding, you know, a line space into it, the whole signature changes, and that means that whole database within the AV and firewalls no longer works, right? So actually, we need some other way of detecting these malicious threats, and that's where the introduction of SIEM came along. Ta-da! So we had Splunk, ArcSight, Logarithm. I think Logarithm was 2003, ArcSight was 2000. I think Splunk was 2003. It's IBM. I didn't need to say it, did I? Right? So yeah. Actually, I think QRadar was a bit later. I think it was getting on for 2005. I thought it was too far away from 2000. So, but yeah. So introduction to SIEM is all about behavior-based detection. So what that means is it's no longer looking at a Boolean value, a yes or a no. It's now looking at what is that bit of executable code doing when it runs in memory, or you know, how is the DLL files? Is it a remote certificate trying to remote thread into memory? And the great thing about that is you no longer care about what the signature is, but the impact of that is that suddenly you're trying to detect something that could actually be legit. And so this is where we now have the introduction of the problem of false positives. And as a lot of organizations know, of those of you that do work in a security operations center, it is a massive issue. And it doesn't matter what SIEM you purchase, if it's Splunk, ArcSight, QRadar, tuning that is incredibly difficult, right? And I remember this back from the days of NetWitness. You know, it is that balance between getting visibility towards also getting a manageable number of incidences. Because you could get all the visibility in the world, but then you're going to be investigating 100,000 incidences a day or something ridiculous. And it's just not manageable. So you'll end up missing the important stuff. So it's about finding that balance within your environment. And then, so if we kind of fast forward to today, you know, as I kind of mentioned at the start of this slide, you know, we're starting to see really advanced persistent threats, you know, very militarized operations, Stuxnet, WannaCry, Zeus. And in fact, things like WannaCry, it's just commonality malware almost. You can buy this offline, but the level of sophistication and the ability to actually circumvent all these security measures is absolutely enormous. And Mike made a really great point at the start of this when he was introducing, was, you know, common organization, the most common type of attack organizations get faced with is phishing attacks. And it's really difficult because it's actually not a technical issue, it's a socio issue, right? It's taking control of the weakest part of the business in that way, and that is the end user, right? We can do as much training as we want, but we are, and myself included, I've clicked on links before, I'm definitely victim to that, you know, subject to those manipulations. And the fear here, and again, the question around this automation piece, is we're already starting to see threat actors being able to automate mass phishing campaigns to a very sophisticated level. Now, the next stage in this is, you know, I predict in the future we're going to start to see them incorporating all of this data where they can automate the pulling down of data that they've harvested from you, you know, email addresses, user passwords, then sifting through, parsing all of your email accounts, sifting out key information it knows about you, and then generating templated emails to automate out. And, you know, this is a massive, massive challenge that we're going to be faced with. So, threat actor, right? And it's no longer just some guy that's out to have a bit of fun to see what he can do on a Windows machine. You know, like I said, it's nation-state threat actors. You know, it's advanced, persistent threats. It's organizations out to make serious money. Anybody watch The US Office? Yes. Dwight Schrute. So this guy is literally, he just tells you how it is, right? And I feel at this point, like, Dwight Schrute would be saying, like, well, you know, we're kind of screwed, right? Yeah, it's time to move to Canada. You know, it's a story of cause and effect, right? If you're going to create a solution, the whole concept here is that as soon as we put something in place, whether it's automation, it's response, it's AVs, SIEMs, and that's just a handful, right? Proxies, VPN servers, you know, all this other security platform, every time we do that, they are constantly going to find a way around it. And yeah, that's sucky, and I personally don't think we're ever going to get to a point, thankfully I'm still in a job, that means, maybe that's the reason. But you know, we're never going to get to a point where we're going to come up with the perfect security measure. We even see that with app stores, right? So the whole concept of developing an app store, you know, it's a validated app, it's been through code checks and all the rest of it. We're still hearing stories of malware getting into these platforms that are locked down and secure. Yes, there's a question.
Question from a slide or two back.
Yeah, no worries.
How did the Stuxnet get across the air gap in the Iranian nuclear plant?
So I believe it was via USB.
Yeah.
So
In other words.
yeah, a human being, exactly. Yeah. So you know, it was a massively orchestrated attack, right? There was loads of people that were clearly involved in it. By the time they actually detected what Stuxnet actually was, it had been spread across pretty much half the world, I think it was. There was loads of machines when they basically released the signature for that version of Stuxnet, and they found it on loads of corporate devices. What's key about the Stuxnet is it only had a single job. If it didn't actually detect the correct drivers it was looking for the Siemens device that controlled the temperature of the spinning nuclear material, it would turn off, and it would just stay neutral, and it would just spread. And this is the problem, is our computers are no longer about efficient programming code. You know, we have loads of stuff on there, and even if I go into all of my drivers and stuff and look at all the DLL files, sometimes I'm like, definitely got malware. Like, this looks proper dodge. You know what I mean? So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Dwight Schrute. Good man. So yeah, you know, it's cause and effect, right? Whenever we create something, there's going to be a response to it. But you know, it's not all bad, right? You know, the point is, we constantly have to do this, right? We're going to have to keep defending ourselves, and we need to evolve faster than they do. And that is the key story here: is that, you know, we need to become more proficient, more efficient. We need to communicate better. And I do discuss, you know, part of this in a bit more detail. So we look at it from a very holistic perspective. You know, we've got that prevention tool, which is your AVs, your firewalls. Then we moved into that era of looking at detection, which was your SIEM platforms, right? The behavior-based detection. And now we're into that kind of response phase, right? And so this is incident response, or what now Gartner has coined SOAR platform. So that stands for Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response, which has 3 pillars. First pillar is incident management. Second pillar is artificial intelligence. And third pillar is automation and orchestration, which we will discuss about more. So, quiz time. I'm afraid you all have to get involved as well, so I want to see everybody's hand at least once, okay? So, and it's absolutely fine. You can put your hand up as many times as you want. So what is the objective, in your opinion, of incident response? So the first one I've got, and I'm really sorry about the small writing, I didn't think about the size of the room or the TV. Number 1, in an organised and methodical manner, address and manage the containment, remediation of root cause and aftermath of a cyber attack as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Anybody going to raise their hand to that one? Yeah? Are you all just copying me? Is that what I'm saying? I know you.
It's wrong there. Don't tell the answers. Number 3.
Oh, we haven't got to number 3 yet.
So, 2, reduction in unplanned interruptions in quality of an IT service. Okay, right, okay, yeah. I'm just making mental notes. Yeah. Number 3, to reduce business risk to an acceptable level. All right, okay. Number 4, minimize business losses and liabilities to the company. Yeah. And 5, deal with legal issues.
What do you mean by that? Yeah. It depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
So, to a certain person within the organisation, if you ask this, and to certain examinations, they're all right? To a security operations centre, things like number 1 is absolutely the key point of it, right? If you speak to a legal team, number 5 is appropriate. If you speak to an IT team, number 2 is appropriate, and probably also to the IT, security operations centre. If you speak to somebody who is in a very senior management position, their responsibility is to reduce overall business risk. When they think of an incident process or its response is about reducing it to an acceptable level, right? Because every organisation, and this is a fundamentally important one I think we need to dive into, is that every organisation could probably, if they really wanted to, have perfect security or thereabouts. But the amount of money it would cost would destroy. They would make zero profit. They would be making hundreds of millions of pounds of loss. And a great example of that is software that we see in critical national infrastructure, things like nuclear facilities, power plants. For a single line of code, it costs 200 times, this is an exaggerated figure, I'm sure, but 200,000 times the cost of writing something that doesn't need to be secure. And again, this is where it fundamentally comes down to organizations need to have a defined risk appetite. And that risk appetite is what defines their risk presence, right? So to an organization, they accept an element of risk that they could be DDoSed or they can have malware outbreak. But as long as it's within their acceptable risk, and this is CISM, this is ISACA terminology, as long as it's acceptable level of risk, that's fine. Anyway, so the argument then becomes like, well, what is better to do? And I want a show of hands. Who thinks prevention is better than responding? There's no wrong answer, by the way. They're both right. Yeah, you're going to go home, you'll be like, God, my bingo wings, they are gone. So, prevention. So, ultimately, there is no wrong answer, right? There is counter-arguments for both. Prevention is great, right? We want to prevent stuff from coming into the organisation that is malicious. The sooner we can prevent it, we know that the cost of responding is significantly more when it's in our environment. Having incident responders, having to do remediation perspectives, looking at the legal implications of breaches, it's enormous, right? We don't want to be in a situation of responding. But it's finding that balance. At the same time, if we concentrate entirely on prevention, we know full well that at some point we're going to be breached, right? Personally, I'm very much a strong believer of prepare for the worst. And you can put all the security measures in place that you want to, but a lot of customers I speak to, they've only after a breach they start to wake up to the fact that, it doesn't matter that we spend one of the largest budgets on prevention technologies, it's still not going to be perfect. I'm trying to save my tagline for the end, but I keep wanting to use it. So, and the next point of this whole big story around the automation piece is the regulations, right? And I spoke to a couple of individuals earlier that have legal backgrounds, so I'm going to be very careful what I say here. But, obviously there's regulations in place that are trying to help organizations and ultimately protect the consumers, right? People, the customers, that data that we shared with these organizations. And that's things like GDPR and, a number of other regulations. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but, regulations are great in place, but a lot of organizations that I speak to are very much challenged by the fact that they can't understand and interpret how they respond to that. There's still, even now, no defined guidelines that say you need to have X, Y, and Z solution. I'm not even saying that that's the appropriate response here. But fundamentally, it's, when we look at cybersecurity, it's a borderless issue. You guys are loving my slides, aren't you? Yeah, it's Google special, this is. It's a borderless issue, and this is a topic around the borderless issue that's been around for many years. I remember talking about the borderless issue in my dissertation. A small little SME organisation is not going to be, the threat actor that's attacking a small little SME that's got a printing firm of 200 employees. He's not going to care that they're in the UK and he's in Ukraine, right? From a legal standpoint, it's very, very difficult to prosecute people when they're in another country because of different laws, extradition, and all the rest. And so fundamentally, for the evolution of incident response in the future, one of the biggest challenges we actually got to be faced with is how we regulate this. Because, if we look at, okay, I'll put this as an example. When was the last time you heard your bank being robbed? Right? I honestly cannot remember the last time my Barclays was robbed. And that's the point of it. Is from a prosecution perspective, there feels, certainly from my perspective, there is more in place from a physical standpoint that if your bank is breached or somebody steals something, it's like, I wouldn't walk into a Sainsbury's and nick a cheese pasty, right? Because I know I'm going to get caught from it. And I'm not saying I would do a cyber attack, but the point is it's a damn sight easier to do a cyber attack and nick, the metaphorical cheese pasty than it is to walk into the Sainsbury's. So my point here is that there needs to be an evolution of that regulatory and almost legal body in terms of how we regulate it, how we monitor traffic. I'm not obviously supporting the whole Big Brother fan, but ultimately there does need some evolution in this space. I've definitely not made any friends in this room, have I? So, the next thing is about, well, what do we do in terms of support that's available for, this future wave that's coming? Well, obviously there is a lot of different bodies out there that do offer documentation. And again, this is a slide for people that are obviously new into this, but you've obviously things like NIST, National Institute of Standard Technology, you've got SANS, you've got ISO 27000K, 27,000, so that's forensics, right? And then we've got NCSC here in the UK, so National Cyber Crimes, NSC, National Cyber Crime, Cyber Security Centre. I'll get there in the end, yeah. But having all this automation is great, right? So, we can go with this approach of saying these threat actors that, by the looks of it, according to my slide here, I basically scaremongered everyone, right? And you're going to walk around, it's like, this is scary stuff. But look, we do have an advantage because, we still appreciate the fact that we have incredibly skilled analysts whose sole job is to protect this organisation. And fundamentally, from a technology, people and process perspective, they are the valuable asset in the organisation. It's not the technology, and I say that as a vendor, right? Technology is going to be an enabler to your organisation. A process is essential, but your analyst is the key part that makes all of it work. We can put automation in place. But fundamentally, we need to understand what automation is doing. And this is a wider issue than just cybersecurity. So the airlines back in 2013, there was a crash of Flight 214, I don't know if you guys remember it in the news. So after that, they started actually asking a lot of the pilots for aviation organisations what they felt about the automation. Would they feel comfortable flying a plane if the systems crashed? And a lot of them turned around and said, I actually don't feel comfortable being able to fly a plane mid-flight if that automation system failed. And the key thing here is about understanding that if you put an automated tool in place or something that's doing a job, you need to understand what that's doing on the back end. We can automate so much stuff, but if that fails, we need to understand how to work it. And so, again, this is something, this experience, this knowledge that we're gaining here, a threat actor, I personally believe in the future, is going to be absolutely banking on the mass-scale automated attacks. Phishing attempts, sophisticated attacks, using their own pieces of AI to gather intelligence and to compromise organisations. Well, fundamentally, we have much more than just that into our portfolio. We don't have just automation, but we also have the concept of orchestration. And this is where that human element, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial in the future. So to define automation, I would say, when a series of conditions are met, it does X, or something does something, right? So if we see an IP address, I want to query an external threat intelligence source, Well, that's a really good example of something that does work for an automation. What doesn't work is if you want to remediate a machine. And that's where orchestration comes in, because the amount of certainty, and fundamentally this is what we're talking about in cybersecurity, it's data certainty and data uncertainty. We live in a world of uncertainty. There's very little things in cybersecurity that is not data certain. We just don't have it, right? So actually the analyst being able to leverage that automation piece and decide when is it appropriate to execute that automation, that is the orchestration. And that is what's going to be the big up on the threat actors, because they're not going to be doing that. They're going to be focused on mass automation scales, and at some point maybe it will change, maybe they'll start looking at orchestration, but they're going to have a single console. I don't think they're going to have as much time for that. So we're talking about 1%, right? And this is the big challenge. They need 1% opportunity to compromise an organization, and we need 100%. So we're not always going to be successful about this, but what is absolutely crucial is as we move into this next phase, we're moving away from not just understanding that we do obviously still need prevention and detection, but the efficiency gains and being able to reduce the time that a threat actor exists in the organization is critical. So as we look into the distance, look into it with me. As we look into the distance, we look to the future. Ultimately, we don't know what the road actually holds, right? We don't have a map. We don't have GPS with us. We know where we've been, and we know from history that every time we put a solution in place, a threat actor is going to find a way around it. But moving forward, it is about keeping one step ahead. And I think right now, the next step for incident response is that orchestration piece. So, with that, I'm going to gracefully say thank you very much. I'll open up to any questions.